You were born into a world where answers arrived long before the questions. Before you asked what lightning was, someone told you it was punishment. Before you wondered where we go when we die, someone handed you a heaven. Before your own mind could shape wonder, fear, or morality, a God was already speaking for you. But that voice, it didn't echo from the stars. It rose from the soil, from trembling mouths trying to make sense of thunder, blood, and grief. Religion wasn't discovered. It was invented, piece by piece, by people like you. Not out of wisdom, but out of need. We were afraid of what we didn't understand, so we painted the unknown with meaning. We carved gods into the dark corners of our ignorance. We built cathedrals to silence the screaming void. And then we forgot that we made them. What began as myth hardened into mandate. What once offered comfort now demands obedience. What was human became untouchable. But if you trace it backwards, through the prayers, the temples, the rituals, you don't find a divine revelation. You find humans terrified, creative, cunning, desperate to make sense of a world that never owed them understanding. This is not a story of faith. It's a story of construction, of fear mistaken for truth, of stories mistaken for systems. Religion wasn't revealed, it was engineered. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee the scaffolding. The birth of gods in empty skies. Long before temples were carved into stone or prayers etched into parchment, there was only the sky, vast, brutal, and unknowable. Early humans stood beneath it, fragile and afraid, watching lightning tear through clouds without reason, feeling the earth tremble without warning. They didn't understand weather or sickness or death. And silence, that endless, unanswering silence, was unbearable. So they broke it with stories. They gave names to thunder. They imagined eyes behind the stars, not because they had evidence, but because they needed comfort. It was easier to believe someone was in control than to accept that no one was. Easier to invent purpose than to face the possibility that suffering is random, death is final, and the sky is just sky. In the howl of the wind, they heard intention. In the flood, they imagined punishment. In the birth of a child, they saw magic. These were not fools. They were survivors. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking structure, something to hold on to in a world that kept changing, without explanation. Religion was not discovered like fire or medicine. It was imagined into being, a psychological shelter built out of fear, awe, and desperation. And once those first stories took root, they didn't fade. They grew teeth. They became gods, stories that became systems. What began as whispers around firelight, tales of spirits, warnings of wrathful skies, slowly hardened into instruction. Myths, once fluid and poetic, became fixed. Repeated enough, they stopped sounding like imagination and started sounding like law. Over time, the stories were no longer told to explore the unknown. They were told to enforce behavior. What had comforted became commandments. The flood myth became a warning. The creation story, a hierarchy. The spirit in the wind was now a god with rules, and those rules were non-negotiable. Morality, once flexible and communal, was bound to divine decree. What you ate, how you dressed, when you bled, who you loved, all of it folded into doctrine. Religion began to organize life, not as suggestion, but as a system. Myths became manuals. Rituals mapped onto calendars. Taboos took shape. And those who claimed to understand the divine became the gatekeepers, the shamans, the priests, the prophets, not just storytellers anymore, but intermediaries, the sacred middlemen. They didn't just describe the gods, they spoke for them. And if you didn't listen, it wasn't just social shame, it was eternal consequence. The system had begun, and belief, once a matter of wonder, became a matter of survival. Holy fear and eternal reward. Once belief became structure, it needed reinforcement. Not just stories, but stakes. Not just faith, fear. You weren't simply disobeying a custom. You were offending the cosmos. You were provoking an invisible authority that watched everything, even your thoughts. This is where religion became truly powerful, when it moved from explaining the world to policing the mind. Heaven was offered as a promise, hell as a threat. One for obedience, the other for doubt. It didn't matter if there was proof. What mattered was the effect. Eternal bliss or eternal fire. Abstract concepts, impossible to verify, yet emotionally absolute. You didn't need chains when people believed they were born guilty. You didn't need a prison when sin was something invisible and ever-present. The afterlife became leverage. It turned uncertainty into control. Every decision became a test, every question a temptation. And the system didn't just punish rebellion, it rewired desire. People didn't just behave out of fear. They wanted to be good, to be saved, to be chosen. The cruelty of it wasn't in the fear alone. It was in the framing. That obedience was love. That submission was virtue. That doubt was a disease only faith could cure. And so religion didn't just claim your behavior, it claimed your conscience, thrones draped in sacred cloth. Once fear was established, it didn't take long for rulers to notice its usefulness. What sword could match the weight of divine approval? What army could command the loyalty that sacred texts demanded? Kings stopped merely governing. They became anointed, not just chosen by the people, but chosen by gods. And that changed everything. To oppose the king was to oppose heaven. To question leadership was to question the divine order itself. Power was no longer earned, it was sanctified. Religion wrapped itself around the throne, not as decoration, but as armor. Temples rose beside palaces, priests stood beside generals, and every law passed by man was echoed by the voice of God. Empires were justified not through strategy, but through destiny. Conquest wasn't greed, it was mission. Colonialism became salvation, obedience became worship, resistance became heresy. And those who controlled the sacred narrative controlled the people. Scripture became a tool set for domination. Patriarchy wasn't just tradition, it was holy. Slavery wasn't just economic, it was divinely ordained. This wasn't faith, it was infrastructure, belief as scaffolding for power. And it worked, because the people didn't just obey the king, they believed he ruled with the sky behind him. Identity forged in faith. As religion wrapped itself around power, it also wrapped itself around people. It didn't just tell you how to live, it told you who you are. From the day you were born, it gave you a name, a tribe, a truth. It didn't just shape your behavior, it shaped your identity. You were not simply a person, you were a believer, a child of God, a member of the chosen. And that made belief harder to question, because to doubt the doctrine wasn't just intellectual, it was personal. To doubt was to betray your family, your community, your ancestors. Your very sense of self was now built on faith. And so the questions stayed buried. Even when something didn't make sense, even when the rules felt cruel, even when your gut whispered that something was wrong, you stayed. Because leaving meant exile, not just from heaven, but from everyone you loved. That's how religion sustains itself. Not with logic, but with belonging. Not with evidence, but with identity. And when belief becomes bloodline, when faith becomes flesh, truth stops mattering. What matters is loyalty, and the cost of doubt is isolation. The myth of eternal truth. Religion speaks in the language of forever. It tells you it has always been this way, the same gods, the same truths, the same sacred laws whispered, unchanged across generations. It claims timelessness as its proof. And yet, if you look closely, you see the edits. Gods evolve, rules shift, rituals disappear, reappear, rebrand. What was once forbidden becomes tradition. What was once central becomes metaphor. Scriptures contradict themselves. Practices diverge by region, by culture, by convenience, and still, believers are told it's all part of the same eternal design. But it isn't. Religions don't stay the same. They mutate. They absorb. They erase. A holy day borrowed from a pagan rite. A divine command that just happens to reflect the politics of the moment. A new prophet, a revised text, a forgotten passage, suddenly emphasized again. This isn't divine consistency, it's human editing. And yet, the illusion persists. The book is holy, The rules are final. The truth is untouchable. But if these systems were truly eternal, they wouldn't need to adapt. They wouldn't splinter into thousands of versions. They wouldn't need to fear questions. The sacred isn't static, it's curated. And the permanence religion promises is more theater than truth. Morality without the supernatural. One of religion's oldest claims is that without it, we would be lost. That morality depends on the divine. That without commandments, chaos would reign. But this is a fiction written by those who feared freedom more than failure. Morality doesn't begin in Scripture, it begins in us. Long before temples were built, humans were cooperating, sharing, grieving, loving, not because they feared hell, but because they felt empathy, because they could imagine someone else's pain, because helping each other made survival possible. Kindness is older than commandments. Fairness is older than faith. And yet religion wrapped itself around these instincts, rebranded them as divine orders, and claimed authorship, as if compassion needs to be commanded to count, as if goodness is only valid when it's monitored. But true morality has never required a watchful sky. It requires understanding. It requires presence. It requires choice. And some of the most monstrous acts in history, genocide, slavery, oppression, were committed not in the absence of religion, but in its name, justified by sacred texts, blessed by holy men. So if religion wants credit for morality, it must also carry its sins. The truth is this: we are not good because we are watched. We are good because we can care. The withering role of religion. There was a time when religion explained everything. Why the crops failed, why the baby died, why the earth shook. If something happened, it was God, pleased or angry, watching or testing. But then we started learning. We learned that disease came from bacteria, not sin. That lightning was electricity, not punishment. That stars were burning gas, not gods watching over us. Science didn't just offer explanations. It offered tools, cures, predictions, proof. And so religion began to retreat. No longer able to claim the physical world, it moved to the metaphysical, to purpose, to meaning, to emotion. It shifted from explaining how the world works to why we're here. But even there, it resisted questions. It wanted the authority without the evidence. Psychology explained the soul. Astronomy dethroned the heavens. History exposed the edits. Bit by bit, religion's grip loosened, not because people hated it, but because they no longer needed it to understand reality. Yet even cornered, it refused to let go. It insisted on relevance. It asked to stay, as comfort, as tradition, as identity. But tradition isn't truth, and comfort isn't clarity. We are no longer wandering tribes beneath a violent sky. We have light now, we have reason. But belief still lingers, not in the absence of answers, but in the habit of holding on to them. The cost of comfort. Religion offers comfort, and that comfort is real. It tells you your suffering has meaning, that injustice will be corrected, that death is not the end. These are powerful ideas. They soothe. They soften the edges of grief, powerlessness, and fear. But comfort, on its own, is not truth. A child can be calmed by a lie. A nation can be pacified by a myth. And this is where religion becomes dangerous, not because it feels good, but because it trades curiosity for certainty. It sells peace, but at the cost of inquiry. If you're told that justice will arrive after death, you may not fight for it in life. If you believe suffering is sacred, you may not try to end it. If you think your enemies are heretics, you may not see them as human. Religion doesn't just comfort the oppressed, it comforts the powerful. It tells rulers they rule by divine right. It tells victims their pain is part of a plan. It tells everyone that questioning the system is dangerous. But comfort without examination is sedation. And sedation keeps us still while the world burns. Yes, we all seek peace, but peace built on illusion is fragile. The cost of comfort is the courage to see clearly, and most aren't ready to pay it. Ownership of meaning. If religion gave us anything lasting, it wasn't truth. It was the illusion that meaning must come from somewhere else, from the heavens, from a prophet, from a book older than memory. But meaning was never waiting for us in the clouds. It was always something we created. In love, in struggle, in learning, building, mourning, trying. You don't need a God to feel awe when your child laughs. You don't need a scripture to know that cruelty hurts. You don't need eternal purpose to make this fleeting life matter. Religion was invented to silence the fear of randomness, to ease the pain of loss, to impose order on a world that offered none. But we are no longer bound to that fear. We can face the unknown without inventing rulers for it. We can build morality from empathy, not obedience. We can craft lives filled with meaning and know that we built them ourselves. Religion wasn't discovered. It was constructed by humans for humans. And now that we know that, we don't have to tear it down. But we can stop bowing to what we made. The sacred isn't above us. It's within us, waiting to be reclaimed. So now, you stand at the edge of the story, not as a follower, not as a believer, but as a witness. You've seen the scaffolding, the edits, the inheritance passed down in ritual, dressed as truth. You've seen how fear built gods, and how silence gave them voices. And now, the question isn't whether religion is true. You already know it was made. The question is, what you do with that knowing. Will you keep pretending the architecture is divine? Will you keep kneeling to myths written by men who feared the dark? Or will you step into the light and start writing your own meaning? Because belief doesn't make something true. Repetition doesn't make something sacred. And just because we've always done it, doesn't mean we still have to. It's not wrong to seek comfort. It's human. But real comfort comes from understanding, from honesty, from courage. Religion was invented, but you are still being written. And this is your chance to choose the author. We made gods to explain the dark. Now we must face the light without them.